So hey guys, how are you guys all doing? You look pretty sleepy this morning. It's a quiet crowd. Yeah, I'm excited to be here at 9:45? My God, whose idea was that? Yeah, so I'm excited to talk to you guys about gaslighting and gender in the workplace. I know it's really uplifting, so let's get the day started on a depressing note and keep going. So as you guys already know from yesterday, I'm Holly. I'm a career coach that works with women in male-dominated industries. My background is in mining engineering. I did that for 10 years. If you want some stories about giant yellow haul trucks, I've got you. I'm also a huge feminism nerd, and hence my interest in this topic. So before we get started, what we're talking about today is certainly not framed in a gentle way, like gaslighting is an emotional abuse tactic, and I'm talking about how it applies at work. So the thing I want to say up front is anytime you're talking about whole groups of people, like for example women, half of the population, I'm going to be making some generalizations. So this may not match exactly your experience or exactly the experience of people that you know, which is totally okay. Just stay open to what I have to say, and I'm happy to chat more about it later because, you know, by its nature, there will be stereotypes, right? Okay, so I want to talk about that question, am I the crazy one? That's the whole title of the talk, right? So you might ask yourself this question when you're totally alone in a viewpoint, like if you're the only person that has a certain opinion at work, and when you try to explain it to somebody else, just nobody gets it. And it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter how you explain it, if you use pictures or words or emails, just nothing really pans out for you. And another key thing to look for is when the solution is just like super obvious to you and everyone else is like, nope, I don't see it. Have any of you guys felt that? Yeah, okay, so a couple people in the room who are clearly my people, because this happens to me all the time. So if it just happens to you once in a while, it doesn't really matter, right? We all have that. It's like, it's no fun. You go home, you probably complain to your significant other if you're anything like me. But you live through it. You're just like, God, that was frustrating, but it's fine. If this happens to you all the time, though, you really start to ask yourself that question. Like, God, am I the crazy one? Like, maybe it's me. Because I keep being the common denominator in all these situations where people just can't understand a word I'm saying, right? So that's pretty brutal. So if that's true and you are the crazy one, maybe your ideas are just awful. Maybe you just have terrible viewpoints. Maybe your communication style is just totally sucky and you can't get a word out properly. It could be some other reason. I don't really know. Ask your friends. Maybe they could tell you if they're feeling a little bit mean that day. But what if that's not true? Like, what if you guys actually do have a valid point? What if the thing that you're saying does matter and you don't communicate poorly? What if you already know that to be true about yourself? Well, then what might be the reason? So what I want to talk to you guys about today is really around this scenario. When you're not wrong, your communication style doesn't suck, but no one else will really pay attention. So that's when we're going to talk about gaslighting. So gaslighting is the denial of a person's lived experience such that they begin to doubt their own perception, judgment, and sanity. So basically, if I have an idea and I feel strongly about it, or even more obvious is when I have a feeling, and I'm like, this is how I feel, and someone else says, no, you don't, right? That's a very clear indicator of gaslighting because nobody else can really know what I'm feeling or make my feelings invalid. They may not feel that way themselves, but they certainly can't tell me that the way that I feel doesn't exist. So this will show up in a bunch of different ways, but either way, one of the key elements is that it'll happen so much that you start to wonder if you're the crazy one. So I'm noticing some parallels there, right, between gaslighting and the scenario we talked about before, where no one will really believe you, and no matter how you try to explain it, it just doesn't pan out. So this starts to feel familiar with gaslighting. So maybe this is what might be happening, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the more subtle dynamics of gaslighting. One thing that's really important about gaslighting is that there's a power dynamic involved. So it's a lot easier when there's an imbalance of power. So this could happen between adults and children. It's actually very common in adult-child relationships or parent-child relationships. It also might happen with bosses and workers, or even people who are senior and junior to each other at work. Because you have somebody, just like in a parent-child relationship, who's in charge of helping somebody with their development, technical or interpersonal skills at work, or with the example of children, like basically raising them up to be a competent human being. And so that person relies on them for feedback. right? And there's a certain power, privileged position that the person, the boss or the senior or the adult knows more than the person in the less powerful position. So it's an easy setup for that kind of dynamic that'll make you go like, oh my God, this really experienced person feels totally differently than me. Like maybe there's something wrong with me then if I don't perceive it the same way as them. And you even see this in therapist and patient relationships. It's really interesting because you go, well, therapists would never try to gaslight somebody. That's the core of what they're not supposed to be doing as a professional. But because of the dynamic, especially with people who have mental illness, they're relying on that person to help them interpret the world, right? So this will show up even there. So I'll imagine, if you guys haven't seen this pattern in your life already, you'll start to see it pop up after we talk about it today, because it does happen in different places. And a key thing is that there's an advisory nature to that relationship, right? So you can see in all of those relationships that the person in the powerful position is giving advice to the less powerful person. Another thing I want to talk about with gaslighting is something that I'm calling the outsider effect. So this is where, for example, I'm a girl, I walk into a room, like any room at this conference almost, and I'm the only one there. So I'm the only one with the set of experiences that I've had for, let's call it 29 years, living, it is 29, let's be clear. But I've had 29 years of experience living in this body and living in the world as a woman, right? So I have a totally different viewpoint than most of the rest of the people in the room, and there's lots of commonality there. We all live in Canada, and all of us probably watched Animaniacs, let's say, when we were kids. I don't know. Yeah, Animaniacs. But we have lots of things in common, but there's part of it that's just different. And when you're only one or two or a small percentage of the room, you by nature sort of already have a dynamic wherein people are not primed to fully get you, right? So we'll see this more on diverse teams. And the interesting thing about diversity, I don't know how much you guys read about this, but part of the business imperative for diversity is that by having more diverse teams, you avoid having groupthink and you come to better decisions, because every decision that's made, in theory, gets more well-examined by people with different viewpoints, right? So this outsider effect probably does show up on your teams and has a real business effect for the people that are in those positions. And it, I would say, also enables gaslighting, because you have that dynamic where somebody's coming from a really different place. Make sense? Cool. So at work specifically, some places you can look for this to show up are in performance reviews. That's a really, really fraught area, because there's somebody actually giving advice to somebody else about, you could frame this differently, but effectively what's wrong with them or what's not working as well about what they're doing. And the implication is sort this out or you'll never be successful here, or sort this out so that you can be successful here, right? And it's done by somebody in a higher position like your supervisor, right? So you might see this here in particular. There's a ton of research. I could go on for hours about it. I won't now. But there's a ton of research around the differences between men and women in performance reviews, and how women's performance reviews are actually more commonly about personality traits rather than behavior. So in particular, when you're talking personality versus behavior, that makes it a really interesting area for gaslighting, because it's not just something you're doing, it's cutting down to who you are, right? And gaslighting is sort of about who you are as a person, not being correct. You'll also see it when proposing ideas. So that comes back to that idea of the outsider effect that we were talking about. So when someone says like, oh, I have an idea, what if we make, then this is a really stereotypical example. I'm sorry, it's the best one I can come up with right now. You probably have better ones. But what if we make our female game characters not wear a bikini? Or maybe be, a little less boobtastic or something like that, right? And people are going, well, we want to sell games and that's kind of how it is. And, have you seen these last 15 that came out? I just don't think it's a problem. And you're going, but, the Twitter storms and girl gamers getting tough lives. And it's like, not a business imperative, move on. So that's an example of a time when proposing ideas can be influenced by that outsider effect and have that same sort of gaslighting thing, like, oh, cool, that's your point of view, nobody cares, right? And you'll also see it in interpersonal conflicts when you and somebody else just differ in opinion about how to get something done. And maybe it's a light disagreement, or sometimes I'm sure you guys have experienced when you're just like, that person's wrong, they're the worst, there's no way that this can be right. People can get pretty heated, right? So you'll sometimes see it there in interpersonal conflicts on different genders or even the same gender, where people will go like, nope, I just don't get your point. I think it's a giant waste of time, and you're crazy to even hold it because it doesn't make any sense. So you'll see gaslighting behavior start to show up there. So something that's really important for you guys to know about gaslighting is that a single incidence of this doesn't really make gaslighting a thing. If this happened to you one time in your life, I wouldn't say that you're just this giant victim of gaslighting and it's going to have these huge effects on the rest of your life or anything like that. What really has to happen is this has to be repeated. It's subtle, right? Like, this is not something that is always super clear. So it has to happen again and again and again for somebody to really get down to that level where they're like, oh my God, am I insane? Right? Like, one argument doesn't make you feel that way. So repetition is really key. And most people aren't out there trying to be manipulative monsters. Like, do any of you guys go into work going like, yeah, I can't wait to manipulate some people today? No? Just me? Okay, there's a few. Thank God I'm not alone. But yeah, most of us, except for us three, are not really that way. We want to go in, we want to do good work, we want our coworkers to like us, we want to have good relationships. So we don't set out in the morning like, oh, I can't wait for another day of gaslighting, this is going to be great, right? Granted, there are a few people like that, not just us, but others. But most of us aren't really there. So how the heck does this happen? Like, it has to be repeated all the time, and you have to either be a monster or accidentally doing this constantly. You're just like, oh, this probably won't ever happen, right? So the repetition doesn't have to be recent. You can actually be preconditioned to have this particular response. So if many times in your life your opinions have been invalid, you're more likely to reach for that, oh, maybe it's me, maybe I'm crazy, right? So you might have a history with this type of abuse. I mentioned earlier that this is actually an emotional abuse tactic, and that's true. So people might have been in emotionally abusive relationships in their past with parents or relatives or even romantic partners. I can definitely think of one friend in particular right now who's in a relationship like that. So, this is probably more common than you think, and people might come into the workplace just already pre-exposed. And you'll also see it in communities that have traditionally been marginalized or in a less privileged position. So women, I think, fall in that category, but as well, minorities of every type, right? We have that experience of, well, not that women are a minority, actually, we're a little more than 50%, but we have that experience of having to defend our point of view as correct quite often, right? Or having that point of view completely ignored. So you might be dealing with somebody, there might be the odd incidents of this, but because of their past history, they might actually reach for that am I crazy question or explanation pretty often. So you don't have to just be a monster. So speaking of gender, some of the things that lead into or play into gaslighting with women in particular at work is the traditional power dynamic between men and women. Whether or not we feel like sexism is over and 2017 is the new frontier, I don't know. But women have really, for a long, long time, had a less privileged position in society. I'd argue they still do. But it's only in the US in the 1970s that it became actually a thing that you could rape your wife. It was impossible legally before because she was your property. Women only got to vote, in the early part of last century. There's still huge battles going on around health in the US for women's rights. And all of that legislation is being passed by old white men, right? So there's been traditionally economic differences as well, I'd say, with men being the head of the household. Like if you look back in the Mad Men era, kind of, right? Women weren't economically empowered and actually didn't even have the power to get a divorce. So there's long been this power dynamic between men and women, and I would say that today, a lot of power, even though we have a much more equal society, and things have changed a lot, there's still a ton of power concentrated in male hands. If you look at, every single Fortune 500 company, I think there's 2 CEOs that are women on those. And if you look at American politics, the most powerful country in the world, or actually any politics, I think it's 30% of countries that have had a female leader ever, like just even one. Including Canada, we had Kim Campbell for 4 days, very little time. So there's still this power dynamic, and And even to the extent that it doesn't exist today, the fact that it has existed for so long has affected how we've been raised. We've all been raised by people who were in that system, and it's part of the culture that permeates. So that power difference that we talked about earlier with gaslighting comes into play with women and men just sort of by virtue of our culture. Another thing that historically has been true is that women's opinions and voices have been given less value. So the most common thing that people will talk about is that phenomenon in a meeting where a woman will say something, here's my idea, nobody cares, and then 10 minutes later, someone else will say it, and suddenly like, oh, great idea, Steve. Have you guys seen that happen in a meeting? I have. Okay, a couple, yeah. That's the common one that people reach for, but you even see it, like there was an article going around a little while ago, maybe like last year, about the Obama administration and how like the female people in his administration had finally cracked the code that if they just keep repeating the same idea like 15 times, then Obama's like, oh, what a good idea, right? So it does happen, and you know, just within this last week, Amal Clooney, who's a human rights attorney, went to the UN to talk about war crimes going on in Iraq and systematic slaughtering of people there. And Time magazine was like, Amal Clooney shows off her baby bump. So what a way to devalue women's voices, right? And when Theresa May and the German Chancellor met up just last week to talk about Britain leaving the EU, the headline was, who cares about Brexit? Let's talk about their legs. Who's got better legs? And if you look up on Twitter, Legsit, then you can see a lot about that. People were pretty pissed. So this happens in subtle ways and in the really overt ways that I've just talked about. And if you'd like some more exploration on this, I'm happy to talk to you guys. But generally speaking, within society, women's voices have less value, and our opinions do too. There are also some specifically female-coded behaviors that women are just trained and expected to do from a young age. So emotional caretaking is one of those things. So if I walk up to anybody, I'll be like, how are you? How was your day? Or even when I came on stage, I was like, God, are you guys tired? You look tired, right? So that's an example of emotional caretaking. And women are also traditionally meant to be the peacekeepers, right? We'll subsume what we want to keep the peace. So you can see in both of these examples how when we're supposed to emotionally caretake and subsume our needs to keep peace, how that might play into gaslighting, right? It really allows us to take on that identity of, oh, they think my opinion's wrong, I don't want to fight with them, and so what I'll do is allow that to happen and just take it on myself and go, well, maybe my opinion is wrong, perhaps I need to correct that because it's endangering the relationship, which women are taught from a young age is supposed to be sacrosanct. How you guys doing? Is this uplifting enough for you yet? Good. Okay, so in more exciting news, let's talk about the emotional effects. So emotional effect one is self-doubt. So you might doubt your perception, you might doubt your intelligence, and you can even end up just doubting your worth as a person. And I just want to take a second to let that settle in the room, like, oh my God, doubting your worth as a person, that sucks. Like, I almost want to cry thinking about that, like that somebody would end up at that point. It's really awful. Shame is also another effect. And there's a difference between shame and guilt. And if you guys want to learn more about this, you can watch Brene Brown's TED Talk or read any of her books. She talks a lot about it. But guilt is when you feel you've done something wrong. Shame is when you feel you are something wrong. And there's a really big difference in emotional weight between those two. And gaslighting is playing into the shame aspect, that you are something wrong. Fundamentally, who you are is broken. People, for obvious reasons, given the above, end up getting quite depressed when this goes on. And it also creates a dependency on the gaslighter, since you can't understand the world yourself and you're so bad at it, but this other person is an expert, you'll keep going back to them for that interpretation, and it actually perpetuates the cycle. So in terms of practical effects at work, what you might see is people who feel like their ideas aren't worth fighting for, so they stop fighting for them. And that's exhausting. Like having to do that every day or every week or every anything, having to feel like you're doing that all the time is so tiring. So they might just kind of go like, ugh, I gotta check out of this. It's too hard. It's really fatiguing. And from that, you'll end up with people silencing their viewpoints and opinions. And we talked earlier about how part of the push for diversity and the value in diversity is having those different opinions. So this is something that enables squashing that, which is really, really sad. And you'll also see people not put their hands up for high-profile projects because it makes them more visible and makes them more liable to this type of attack, which is pretty emotionally devastating, as we already discovered. So that behavior makes total sense. And as a result of, being quiet, not ever saying anything in a meeting, and nobody knowing who you are or what you think, and never taking on any high-profile projects, you'll probably have less of a chance for a promotion and a raise. Not to mention the fact that if you feel like you're total garbage, like, are you going to go to your boss and be like, I'd like a raise, please? It's pretty tough, right? So these are some of the effects. This is what it really translates to in real terms. And another effect that I would contend comes partially from this, although not totally, is that 50% of women in STEM fields leave within their first 10 years of their career. Like 50%. It's crazy high. 40% of those leave within the first 7 years, and 30 within the first 3. So these are women who have spent, 4 years on a degree plus 10 years working, and they're like, nope, this is too hard, I'm gonna leave. 50% of the people that do leave end up using their skills in self-employment or working for the government or something like that. But 50% of them just up and leave the field and find jobs elsewhere. It's not that they're like, I'm gonna go be a stay-at-home mom. They still wanna work, but they leave because it feels hostile. So this is kind of the emotional context and work context that I want to give you guys for this type of dynamic that happens at work. And look, all of us will probably at some point find ourselves the gaslighter. I mean, I can think of an example that happens at least once a week of gaslighting between my boyfriend and I. He's very ticklish, only sometimes. It's super annoying. And so sometimes I'll touch his arm and he's fine. Other times I'll touch his arm and it tickles. And he'll like, don't do that, it tickles. And I'm like, it doesn't tickle. Right? So that's crazy. That thing that I do, it's actually quite harmful to him, right? But you guys will one day, I'm sure, like I have, look at yourself in horror and be like, oh God, I'm gaslighting. Holly would be so ashamed of me, right? Or myself would be so ashamed of me if you are Holly. But yeah, it'll happen. It's not the end of the world if you do it all the time. Maybe you're one of those 3 monsters like me in this room. But yeah, it does happen, and I think it has real effects on our workforce. So if you guys want to talk about this a little more, I'm around. I'll probably propose an open session later on. My contact info is there, and I'm happy to talk to you guys about anything you'd like, and we can probably take like one question. We have 2 minutes and 30 seconds. We're a little ahead. Okay, questions? Yeah.
As someone who's probably gaslit someone else, what tips could you give to for people to become self-aware that they might be doing this?
Right.
I wouldn't say very well-known term. It's like a year ago.
Yeah, so the question, guys, for those of you that had trouble hearing was, if you're worried you might be doing this, what can you look for? So the key points are that you're invalidating somebody else's lived experience. So if you ever tell somebody that their feelings are wrong, like, guaranteed that's gaslighting, like for sure, because you have no idea what they could feel. And so the difference between, I guess, asking a question or not agreeing with somebody and gaslighting is, if you ask a question, you can say like, oh, I don't really get that viewpoint. Can you explain it? What does it mean? And they might explain it, and you'd go like, it just from here doesn't seem like it really exists. I'm sure it does for you, but it doesn't make sense to me, right? So that's an example of taking in somebody's opinion, valuing it, and still going, it doesn't really land, versus me going, like, no, I don't think that happens, right? And the other person's left going like, well, it does, so now what are we gonna do, right? So being more careful around your framing will help you not do it, even in situations where you don't necessarily agree. But yeah, look out for that moment when you are invalidating someone else's experience, and especially in kind of a harsh and definitive way. Gaslighter is usually pretty confident, so if you, I am the type of person that can pretty easily, in a meeting, derail the whole thing and start running it myself. If that's you, pay extra special attention, because it'll be easy for you to slip into it. Anybody else? Yep.
Some people are predisposed to be susceptible to gaslighting. Are there people that are predisposed to gaslighting?
That's something I actually couldn't answer. It's a great question. So I would posit that the thing I just said, that it's easier for people who are really confident to do it. It's hard to gaslight somebody if they're like, here's my opinion. You're like, well, maybe you're wrong, right? Like, that's just not going to make somebody doubt their sanity too much. So there's that certain amount of confidence that I think is a part of it. But I actually haven't seen any studies that say, people with these personality traits are more predisposed. Although I'm sure, there are certain personality disorders, like maybe narcissistic, that would fall into that. And if you guys want to see it in action, actually, it's just like watch Donald Trump's Twitter. Or read some news about the inauguration crowd size. Like, what a great example of national gaslighting. And actually, so many people, many Republicans now, when they look at the photos, and I don't know if you guys have seen them, like, it's pretty clear. Not that I'm really in the tank for the Democrats, which obviously I am, but it's really clear that Trump had less people than Obama. But I think 30% of his supporters are actually like, no, the crowds were much bigger. Even when looking at the photos, they'll say that. So sorry, I've derailed this into a discussion about my favorite hobby, American politics. Great.
What do you recommend for women in the field when you're interrupted, or when a guy takes over and says what she meant was?
What she meant was. So the question was, what do you recommend for women when they're interrupted or a guy takes over and says what she meant was, which is delicious. Thank you for that example. Yeah, so, women are supposed to be nice, right? We're not supposed to offend other people. So depending on how badly you want to shake things up, one thing you could do is just get all fired up about it and be like, hey, I was talking. Depending on your relationship with people, you can do that or not do that depending on how it shakes out. But a softer approach is just kind of wait and then say, okay, great, getting back to what I was saying, or no, actually, that wasn't really what I meant, although thanks for explaining to me how you see it, here's what I'd say. And then just wait for them to be done, take it over, and move on. Does that help? Great. Yes?
So for those of us in the room who are managers, obviously outside of the meeting context, we want to be able to promote a culture which supports women's voices being heard, and in which people try to correct the kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
Do you have one or two suggestions for how we can promote that kind of culture outside of the meeting context?
Outside of the meeting context, I think, so speaking from my own personal experience, this has happened to me many times in meetings and not in meetings at work. I recall quite strongly a whole team of people actually coming to get angry at me for a report I had done, reconciling how we had done our work in the past couple months. They felt it made them look badly, despite all of us not doing an amazing job and the results showing that. So I was effectively accosted and held hostage in this little impromptu meeting where they said, like, everything is wrong, Holly. Isn't that wonderful? It was a cool day. I, cried a lot. And so, in that situation, like, that became something I took to my supervisor and said, like, look, here's what's going on. There's massive discontent in the team. You at least need to know about it. And also, P.S., I'd love some help because this sucks, right? So take those concerns seriously. And, I think a common way for supervisors to manage is to go, well, 4 out of 5 people on the team don't see this as a problem, so it's probably just you. And there's validity to that approach in some cases, but watch for patterns, right? Because like I said, this is a pattern-related thing. It happens over time. So pay attention and make sure that that you let the person who has the non-majority opinion be heard. I think it was it Nell yesterday? Someone yesterday, maybe it was you, said, that, oh God, what was it? Now I've started on it, I can't remember, but they basically said, you have it?
No, I'm wondering what I said.
Oh. Oh no, I'm so sorry. So someone basically said, it was in a breakout, sorry Nell, false alarm. Someone said that people don't get upset when their ideas aren't implemented, they get upset when their ideas aren't heard. Right? So make sure that everybody's ideas are heard, and try to, in a meeting and a non-meeting context, try to foster those ideas, especially when you have quiet people on your team. They might be quiet because they're shy, but they might be quiet because historically nobody listens to them. So listen carefully and with a lot of curiosity. Okay?
So somewhat similar to Chris's question about if I'm not in the meetings where things are happening, but maybe there are things happening, how might I be able to recognize the symptoms better?
So I'll ask you a question. Do you know about them? Or are you like, there's some mystery gaslighting going on and I want to...
I had some active gaslighting and we fired someone not too long ago.
That's a great response.
Which I found out and then he was gone. But it turned out it had been going on for like 7 months and we didn't know.
Right.
But so I would have loved to recognize or had anyone else recognize earlier. So just more things to look for.
Yeah. So I mean, you could have a conversation with your team about this specifically, and especially given that it happened, it sounds like not too long ago, just say like, hey, you know, we had to let that guy go, and I went to this super amazing talk with this really cool girl about gaslighting, and you know, it came to my attention that I really want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So team, here's what you might look out for, and I want you to know that if this is happening to you, I want to hear about it. And then again, listen carefully and curiously to people who bring that to your attention. But yeah, build the awareness and look out yourself. Like drop in on meetings, drop in on one-on-ones, keep your ears open and intervene and make sure that people have a chance to be heard. Yeah.
You said dropping in on one-on-ones. One of so you have one-on-ones with your manager, you have one-on-ones with your skip level.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for when that keeps going up?
When what keeps going up?
When, the effects of gaslighting keep going up. I don't know.
Oh, so when you're being gaslit at multiple levels of the organization? So the quick plan for dealing with gaslighters, people who have to deal with them, step one is just kind of mention that it's happening and see if that will work, right? So step one is say like, you know, I feel like you're really not hearing my opinion, and I get that that's how you see it, but here's my opinion, and I'd really like you to hear that, right? So you can say that in a kind of non-confrontational way. With most of us who are not manipulative, awful people, that will probably work. It might need some reminding, but it'll probably be okay. If that doesn't pan out, level 2 is to start setting boundaries. And if you're doing this with somebody at your level, basically, how many of you guys know about boundary setting? I might be jargony here. Okay, so boundary setting is when you basically decide for yourself what you're willing to put up with, and then tell somebody that thing, and then act on it. So I might say, you know, Steve, I'm happy to have conversations with you about our technical work, but when you get to that point where you start belittling my ideas and opinions and saying that they just don't matter, that's crossing a line for me. And so if that continues, then I'll just leave the conversation. Then, the next time he does it and every time thereafter, you have to leave the conversation. You can't just make the empty threat. If you're going to do that, though, you're going to put a limit on how you guys interact as a team. So you really need to let your supervisor know, and I would contend also HR, as well as taking notes. Not only to help yourself if you end up in front of HR as a difficult employee, for example, who won't finish conversations with Steve, but also because sometimes HR or management will be able to case to let somebody go, and that will help them do it. And so you'll be like saving yourself and everybody from this person. And then step 3, which it sounds like is more sort of where you're at, because if it's at multiple levels of the organization, you know, I mean, what are you really going to do? Go talk to the CEO and hope he takes your side? I mean, maybe in a small company, but if you work for like ExxonMobil or Microsoft or something, it's going to be a little tough. So step 3, honestly, leave. Like nothing, to me, very little in life is worth this kind of price. The effects of gaslighting, if it's gotten really bad at work, can be pretty far-reaching. I've seen it take people like a year to recover from this kind of things, and sometimes even longer. So my advice, straight up, in that situation, go find another job.
Just to clarify, that's not happening to me.
So everybody knows, he's okay, he's okay. Whoever employs him, he's not bailing, don't worry. Back there, and this will be the last one.
So the effects of gaslighting are very serious, emotionally and psychologically. How can you, as a person who's been pre-exposed to gaslighting, when you go into a new workplace, how can you gain confidence and strength to overcome those things that happen so that you can be the person that you want to be in your career path?
That's a great question. So he basically said, if you are one of those people who are predisposed to gaslighting, what can you do to help build your confidence and build yourself up so that this doesn't happen to you at work all the time and so that you can have the kind of career that you want? So it's a really great question. For me, part of the answer, and look, that I come from that camp, so I'll speak to it personally. For me, part of the answer is do quite a bit of intensive self-work, especially if that happened to you from a young age. There's a lot to unpack there usually. So do some self-work, get in a room with a therapist or a coach or somebody that can be a mirror to you. And on that same note of finding mirrors, develop allies both at work and outside of work. People who will go like, no, that is nutty. Like, what's happening to you doesn't make sense, and you don't deserve that. And then I would say as well, implement as a practice, even if it's tough to believe in, implement as a practice those 3 things that I talked about, where you actually actively stand up for yourself. Because one of the most harmful things about doubting yourself is watching you allow yourself to get hurt and being complicit in that. So faking it till you make it in that area, I think, is a great start. Okay, guys, thank you. I'm going to let someone else take the stage.